Where does a house truly begin? Is it at its perimeter walls, at the property limit? You see, from extending the limit all the way to reinforcing it, architects have answered this question with radically different ideas. In this video, I'll be exploring some of the most iconic of these ideas, and top it off by showing you how I approach one of my own projects, applying these concepts. Then I'd love to hear which approach resonates with you most. In 1993, Lacaton Vassal addressed this question as they were designing a house for a family with a very tight budget. In order for them to be able to double the house, they started looking into greenhouse architecture. Now, this may seem commonplace today, but back in the day, it was quite a radical approach actually. The result was this flexible space that was attached to the house, effectively achieving the goal of doubling the space. Now, of course, the feeling inside the greenhouse is not going to be the same as the one you would feel in the proper house, but that's part of its charm, because your expectations for this space are not going to be as high as the expectations for the proper inside of the house. This limited expectation, combined with the possibility of opening up the windows or shading the space, make the space feel that much more comfortable and widens your comfort zone, making you more tolerant to these temperature swings, which you would probably not accept in an indoor setting. And just as important, when you're in the greenhouse, do you think you're inside or outside? And that's the magic of it. I'll let you decide. Japanese architect Junya Ishigami follows a similar approach, but instead of adding a greenhouse to the back of the house, like we just saw Lacaton Vassal do, he wraps the whole house with a greenhouse, effectively having now two envelopes, one for the house itself and one for the zone which is thermally conditioned. This is a very clever approach because then the energy consuming part of the house is vastly reduced. Of course, the rest of the house now is this area which is neither out nor in, effectively blurring the limit. And in this house, you can actually have a tree growing in your own living room. Now, I showed this house in my Instagram and I had a lot of comments, people saying that then you would have to live with the mold and whatever. That's all true. Like for the rest of these houses, you don't need just a bold architect, but you need a bold client willing to live in this kind of house. That new space now created between the two envelopes lives in this region which is neither out nor in, where you have plants and trees growing next to your refrigerator. And again, we see that as in the Latapie house, the height for this area is not a typical one, is enhanced. It's a double height. Because again, you need that sense of amplitude to feel in an outdoor space. What actually limits this space is the floor. Because in one area you have soil where the trees are, and then the area which is meant to be lived upon is delimited by the concrete slab. So we can add into this mix another limit. We have the external facade to the street, the internal one that delimits the thermal zone, and yet a new one which is set by the concrete slab. When designing his own family home, Brazilian architect Paulo Mendes da Rocha took a radical approach, and that is to have the bedrooms be set back from the facade. Furthermore, the block that houses the bedrooms doesn't really touch the ceilings, leaving a gap there. So the whole house is quite noisy in a way. And you can hear what's happening on the other bedrooms probably if you're there and you pay attention. But this wasn't so much a problem for the family. This also meant no side windows or ventilation to each individual room. So you can see how drastic the approach was. The only direct daylight the bedrooms would get would come from a hole in the roof. But the benefit of having done that is that once you open the uninterrupted windows from the opposite facades, inside becomes out. And the cross ventilation coupled with the high thermal mass of the concrete works wonders to mitigate the Paulista warm and humid climate. It's probably a simple but a powerful approach, even putting on the table what you're giving up for what you're getting. I think that's already quite commendable. This house has quite a bit of tricks up its sleeves, especially considering daylight. And I'll be talking more about it on another video and on my article regarding designing with daylight. So be sure to subscribe to a newsletter to be kept on the loop. Now, of course, if we're talking about blurring the limits, we have to talk about the modern vernacular of Harquitectes, because they are the masters at designing these buffer spaces which are not entirely outside and not entirely inside, and they serve to mitigate the temperatures, helping you transition from inside to out, but also helping the house work better because it's next to a space where the temperatures are not as drastic. Take this house, for instance, that they designed in Granollers. Granollers? Something like that. Hope I'm pronouncing it right. Here, they introduced a triple height space that helps transition between the street and the house. Now, what's interesting about this space is that it has a very high thermal mass with all that exposed, unrendered brick. This thermal mass helps mitigate the daily swings. Even when you look at their section, you can see that the temperature is allowed to fluctuate more here because it's not as controlled as in this other area where temperature is more controlled. Again, they are applying the strategy of thermal zoning. And it's interesting to see how they let it free run unhindered, and they're not bothered at all by the temperature reaching levels which could be considered uncomfortable, because they know that the expectation set on this space is not going to be as high as the expectation set in the proper house. But the whole role of this space does not limit itself to a sustainability approach, if you can say that. It's also a reinterpretation of the threshold itself. By moving gradually from public to private, as Jan Gehl would argue, our sense of belonging extends from our own front door. The house doesn't stop where it opens up onto the street. It's more like it unfolds into the street. And that is an important distinction that makes it so much more agreeable. Now, this is another important strategy, and I think that in this particular case it works beautifully, because in this project, Poli by Pezo Von Ellrichhausen, the architects were trying to emulate the sense of creating a sort of refuge, protection, giving you shelter from the harsh outdoor conditions found at the foot of the Cordillera de los Andes, where it meets the Pacific Ocean. This is a beautiful scenery, but I would imagine it's windy, it can get hot. So creating a sort of bunker gives that idea of protection and solace. And this idea is reinforced by using such a strong platonic shape as is the cube. Now, the cube commands its dimensions, because if you extend one direction, it's no longer a cube. And this plays into the idea of not extending it into the outdoors, creating these middle spaces. These middle spaces had to be inside the cube. And that's where the beauty comes in, because what the architects did is just magnificent. They reinforced this idea of protection and bunker and created this thick, habitable wall where the circulation spaces and the service areas would be located, freeing up the center. So it's really very counterintuitive, because normally architects, when faced with this kind of situation, you would either put all the service and circulation areas to the back so you can open up into that magnificent view, or set it in the middle of that so again you can exploit the views. By turning the house inside out, they allowed for the creation of these spaces that work as transitional spaces. So they are in a way reinforcing the limit with the language of the architecture, but they still bring to the table these spaces which are neither out nor in. When I began designing Stilt House, I wanted to push this idea of blurring the limits, and my clients were completely on board. The plot was beautiful. It had a gentle slope to the south and was surrounded by trees. The plan was to let the house hover ever so slightly above the ground, touching the plot only where you would access it. And it was going to be supported by prefabricated steel stilts, which would be screwed into the ground. This was meant to allow us to touch the land very delicately, especially considering that the rest of the house was going to be built with prefabricated CLT panels, which would be sustainable, light, dry, and fast to assemble. But unfortunately, reality had other plans. The soil test came back, and the ground was just too poor to handle this kind of solution. We had to go for concrete instead. For that, we had to dig in and basically do exactly what we did not set out to do. It was a disappointment, certainly, but it's things that happen. It was a reminder that every architectural idea has to negotiate not only with the climate, but with the pre-existing conditions on site. Still, we managed to keep the essence of the project, and we tried to turn this into an advantage for it, because that concrete slab was also going to work for our favor, as it was going to bring to the table the thermal mass that CLT panels simply don't have. So what we did in order to blur the limits in this house was we created a running greenhouse along the southern facade. To make the most out of it, we shifted the entire house so that it would face due south. This would allow us to make better use of passive solar gains, which would then be trapped in our greenhouse and stored in our concrete slab. The glass is also playing a very important role by not allowing wind to blow that hotter air from our buffer space. We also shaded the top part of the glass so that the windows from the proper house could be protected from unwanted solar gains. And it works beautifully because the thermal mass preserves the heat, releasing it slowly to the space as the day dwindles down. Now, I had the pleasure and opportunity of going back to the house 5 years after it was completed and visit my former clients, current friends, and they told me that they spent the most amount of time in that space, which is not mechanically heated nor ventilated. Here in Belgium, they even held a Christmas dinner in that space, which for me really is quite something. So where is the proper limit of the house? Well, from looking at Lacaton Vassal's extension to Pezo Von Ellrichshausen's thick walls, I think the answer lies somewhere in between. It really depends on the projects you're trying to make and the idea you want to reinforce. It has to consider the climate and sustainability, certainly, like every other strategy in architecture, but it doesn't have to follow an axiom set by sustainability. That's it for me.